want to introduce our very established and eminent keynote speaker, Walter Lorenz. So Walter was a professor of social work at University College Cork in Ireland, and at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy, where he served as 2 4-year terms as rector. So he's currently a contract professor at Charles University Prague from Germany, and qualified as a social worker in the London School of Economics, practicing for 8 years in East London. So Walter has understood from very many different vantage points and thought from many different vantage points. So I'm really excited to hear his thoughts on this particular moment and how we think beyond this particular moment. So he's going to talk today, and the title of his talk is Raising the Social Question in the Pandemic, the Way Forward for Social Work. So enough from me, over to yourself, Walter.
Hello, Walter. I can see Walter and I can see Heather. Great to see you, Walter.
You're muted, Walter.
Sorry, good to see you as well. Yeah, the buttons keep flashing. Do you show my slides, or do I have control of them?
You should have control of them, Walter.
Okay, I don't.
I've shared them, but my screen's being a bit jumpy, so it's hard for me to know what you guys are seeing.
Should
Can you
I
see Walter's slides?
Should I do it myself?
That would probably be easier.
Okay, if I do the share screen.
Yeah, let me just unshare mine and you should be able to share yours.
Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
We can see.
Wonderful.
You're in control.
Okay, right.
Thank you, Walter.
Okay, so let's use the time, but I first of all do want to thank you for inviting me, and indeed for organizing this very impressive lineup of speakers. And I think it's the right moment to consider those kind of questions that you have put on the agenda. I will be talking about basically how the Corona crisis has shaken me up into thinking about the very essence of social work. And I think it is a crisis that we really do need to use in order to locate ourselves. And locating ourselves, I think, has to do with reaffirming what we as social workers mean by the dimension of the social. I think, yeah, the Corona crisis is not just a global crisis. I think it is manifesting itself also as a crisis of globalization itself, because what becomes so evident is that globalization had been driven by a very narrow set of economic principles, and the effects of those economics have had an enormous impact on what I would call the social fabric of societies, the bonding of societies, which has been problematic since, well, the dawn of humankind, but particularly in modernity. But I shall be talking about the various attempts of redressing the effects. And we are in such a situation now again. As we all know from daily reports, the crisis has deepened the divisions that have not been caused by the Corona crisis, but have been building up or deepening over the last decades. And therefore, we have to recognize that apart from it being a health crisis, it is indeed predominantly a social crisis and has to be confronted like that. And there are some attempts at doing that, but the attempts are very inconsistent. What it does, it calls for me into question social work's role in relation to these ruptures, because we can really compare the current state of transition to what Durkheim has termed anomie, which is the uncertainty about what kind of social rules and conventions hold our societies together. And therefore, very much depends on how we define and understand social. And my hypothesis is that we have not raised what is called the social question in last decades, rather than being confronted with an elimination of that question. If we look historically briefly, social work has indeed its origins in times when this social became problematic. As we all know, social work, I think, is not a time-honored profession, but it's a very modern profession that has its origins in the disruption of social bonds caused largely by capitalist industrial revolution and all the political upheavals that accompanied it. Its mandate has been to reconstruct this social fabric, and we have learned since that it is the consistent tendency of capitalism to eliminate, or at least to externalize, the question of what is social, because the market relies on self-interest, and the more self-interest, the less social considerations need to come into it. So social work has been challenged to respond to those new situations, always in two directions. One was a retrospective approach of mending what is in danger of falling apart or being torn apart, and therefore going back to family, community, and all the paternalism that goes with that. Churches, civil society, big society, what have you. Or it can also look to a transformative agenda, assisting people in facing up to the new social realities that we live in. Situations of anonymity in urban contexts. We appreciate personal freedom. We have to get used still to the exercise of democracy. And that means social work has a political dimension about it in addressing those forward-looking dimensions. If we look again historically, that when was the social question being debated and raised, and therefore has always given an impetus to social work, there were some key moments, as I can see it. After World War I, the impetus was for better welfare protection. If you just look at the origins of many social work initiatives, schools, methods, with Jane Addams and Alice Salomon, culminating in the first international conference on social work in Paris in 1928. The other big disruption was, of course, fascism, Nazism, Second World War. And we have to remind ourselves that an institution no less than the United Nations, after its foundation, after the Second World War, commissioned a total of 3 global surveys on social work education, expressing thereby how important social work really was for the reconstruction of societies after the war, but then also particularly on decolonization processes and democratization programs in the context of what we have since seen, or in those decades seen, as the development of distinct welfare models. Another period following these initiatives was the Cold War period, where the conflict between capitalism and socialism has also given rise to an emphasis on social protection, and therefore of cushioning the impact of capitalism on Western societies. And I think it's well worth looking at the falling apart or falling away of that confrontation with the events of 1989, when we can see that social work is being re-established in former communist countries, but is also changing its character then on account of completely new economic priorities coming to the forefront. Therefore, I think in this corona crisis, we have to see that we raise the voice of social work in terms of asking for a new social contract, because it's not a question of going back to the welfare consensus after the Second World War or even earlier. We really have to take account of the new situation that has arisen, and particularly of the dilemmas that we are facing at the moment in this crisis. So what has been the impact of the principles of neoliberalism? Just to summarize the main points briefly, the emphasis on the privatization of common goods, water, education, health, communication, and then increasingly other services as well. The idealization of individualism, of personal freedom and autonomy, and in the wake of that, also the downgrading of care and personal services as something really quite inferior. And what we see all of a sudden in the crisis is the attempts at correcting those kind of tendencies of the past decades. We are forced, governments are forced to demarketize privatized goods, for instance, medicine and vaccines, even though the private market still plays an important role there. But this is part of the contradictions we are facing. We see the rediscovery of the importance of collective responses rather than the appeals to individualism, and this even in the of the bastion of liberalism and individualism, the United Kingdom. We see an enormous contradiction between control measures that limit personal freedom and autonomy and rediscover again the importance of mutual dependency, even though politics cannot come to terms with that necessity. And we are celebrating care workers as essential and as heroes, even though that doesn't reflect in appropriate pay measures quite. The impact of capitalist globalization, therefore, on social work, briefly summarized, the emphasis on social problems as personal issues. I think this pressure was felt in most countries that I had contacts with. We see the rise of the principle of activation, social workers having to activate service users. And this is the stick to beat service users with if they do not activate themselves sufficiently. Restrictions on political perspectives in social work that confounded by the pressures of daily work, which leave very little space for social workers to become politically active within work situations. Short-term outcome orientation and managerial control through regulations. What needs to be done in relation to those erosions of what actually guided social work? I just want to summarize that, and we'll be pointing that out in the remainder, that we have to rediscover the importance of community action, empowerment as a matter of basic rights and social justice. The political mandate of social work is unavoidable and is not a private sideline of some social workers. We have to look at not short-term outcomes, but the sustainability of participatively achieved changes, and not just at the personal level. And I think it's worth looking at the re-establishment or establishment of something like professional autonomy in the face of all the imposition of regulations on us. Central reference point for me in all of that has been the quite revolutionary definition of social work, international global definition worked out by IASW and IFSW in 2014, which I use in my introductions to social work quite extensively, because every single formulation in that spells out really where our future should lie. And I'm looking with great interest at the agenda, the global agenda, in implementing those kind of reference points in practice. And social workers have great backing from the international organizations in that regard. So I want to pick out just a couple of characteristics that I think social work needs to focus on in future that have become particularly evident as valuable and as forward-looking in the corona crisis. So first of all, social work promotes inclusion instead of what have we all learned to live with, social distancing. And social distancing was not just a spatial distancing, which should have been called anyway, but it really deepened the social divisions in society. Social work is about social relationships. Wherever, in whatever field of social work we are operating, mental health, disability, all has to do with broken social relationships internally and externally, and in most cases in combination. Therefore, the attribute social refers both to the sphere of personal relationships, where, for instance, relationships within families can be broken and strained, but also the social belonging of individuals to entire entities, social entities, like communities, neighborhoods, and indeed society or a nation. And therefore, social work has always a psychological and a political dimension about it. And this isn't just a proclamation of some abstraction, but it is something that needs to inform and influence social work practice. What can
Walter,
we
you just have a couple minutes left.
Yeah,
Time
from
check.
the corona crisis in that regard is that it has really called into question what connects people with each other. Social networks are insufficient. Enormous drive now to re-establish social occasions and to reoccupy social spaces. But social life needs a format and cannot just be left to be formed spontaneously with all the risks that that involves. And we therefore need to look at the organization of social living together rather than just the mechanics of it. The second point is that social work is a speciality in dealing with uncertainty. We should affirm, and that was clear in the first session this morning, our speciality being in academic terms, complexity. Social issues are complex issues and need therefore an appropriate epistemology with all the criticism of a narrow evidence-based practice. And therefore applied knowledge is a matter of co-production in every respect. Again, the uncertainties in the corona crisis are evident that scientific experts cannot deliver the degree of certainty that is expected of them. The combination of science and politics has been very confusing, and expert knowledge has proven not to be neutral and cannot be neutral, but has ethical implications which need to be brought to the fore. The third point is that social work is about social justice, and without reference to social justice, we are into counseling and coaching, and that's not social work. Therefore, being committed to values and ethical principles must be expressed particularly in anti-oppressive practice. And we see that care work is a very complex activity that should command much higher respect, both in academic and in professional terms. The conflict between autonomy and universality is one of the fundamental contradictions that is becoming clear in the corona crisis. It's become quite clear that unemployment now and all the consequences cannot be attributed to personal failings. I see great importance in the Black Lives Matter movement that erupted not for nothing in the middle of the crisis and has exposed the systematic and institutional form of racism and oppression. And care work is something essential and not optional to society. So my final point is that we need to look at mental health as constitutive of well-being, and mental health, again, something that is structurally embedded and not just a psychological phenomenon. We have learned that isolation of any kind is detrimental to mental health. If we just look at the reinforced violence that has manifested itself in the crisis, domestic and personal, interpersonal violence. Therefore, social work addresses isolation in every respect and has to take mental health in this comprehensive view as an indicator of stable identities, also to avoid stigma and secondary victimization. In other words, the corona crisis has demonstrated the personal is political, as the old feminist slogan goes. Lockdown conditions have exacerbated mental health problems, but we also need to realize that resilience has proven to be very strongly present amongst people who are firmly embedded in social units and communities. And Black communities, for instance, show a very different resilience profile from white communities in that regard, who have been more subject to individualization. Human contact and communication are essential for general well-being, and we really need to look at the whole spectrum of communication and not just the electronic dimension that has been so in the forefront. And structural inequalities have something to do with depression and suicide, again, as Durkheim has taught us already. So in conclusion, I want to say that social work's main role in the post-pandemic era is to negotiate between pre-existing and deepened polarizations that erupted in the crisis. And I take as the main indicators of this polarization, the polarization between collective responses and the demand, the justified demand for individual freedom and agency, care and control as the dual mandate of social work has become very, very topical again. And we need to look at how we deal with that in social work in a critical way. Closeness and distance, if we just look at how professionalism is sometimes associated with keeping a distance, how the scandals in residential homes have made staff and care workers unsure about what kind of closeness is appropriate. And that has been a dilemma very evident in the crisis. Science and ethics and the personal and the political. So to conclude, social work has to become a transformative force at all levels, the knowledge creation level, the level of the reorganization of services, has to raise its voice in the context of politics, particularly in the total uncertainties about how to address diversity now, with populist politics having simplified versions of identity presented to us. And at an international level, I think social work has something to say about where the European unification project, and indeed the globalization project itself, is going wrong and will end in disaster if these kind of social voices are not being taken seriously. So with that, I have compressed my impressions from the last 12 or 16 months in the 20 minutes, and I look forward to the discussion that we now have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was very impressive compression of loads of sort of really fascinating themes of thought. I know that I have a number of questions brewing in my head. So what I shall say to everybody is that if you have a question for Walter, you can choose whether to put your hand up or whether to put your question in the chat box. So for folks attending, please do that just now. While folks are mulling over their questions, I'm deciding which one to choose. There was a number of points you picked up that piqued my interest, and I guess one of them is something that I struggle with, and I think we touched on when we chatted a couple of weeks ago. And I think this notion of social workers working with the collective and working with community, and sometimes that involves challenging the political momentum of the day. And I would say from my context in Scotland, and it's been interesting talking to colleagues from other parts of the world and how social work is conceived. In Scotland, social work is very much about those people who work for local authorities, and even students and folks that I've worked with, colleagues I've worked with who would go on and work in community organisations might stop calling themselves social workers because they're working in the community, if you like. And although Scotland has a strong history of community education and community development, it very much sits this work, this collective work that is political at this point in time, it seems to me, and those on the call can argue, seems to me to very much sit within community who are also compromised by taking money from the hand that feeds them, if you like, from the state. So I suppose there's a question in here about how does social work become that if social workers are paid by and working within the policy directives of the state, who are often driving these neoliberal furrows. Do you have to step outside of social work? And perhaps you know of places that you have worked and have connection who manage to negotiate this, because they're different from Scotland, and because social work is conceived differently from Scotland. So.
Yes, I mean, as you outlined, this is a wide issue, but I think one of the problems is that social workers have become, have been forced to concentrate far too much on their professional identity and to defend themselves against the encroachments of, I don't know, psychology and other care and coaching professions, instead of seeking alliances and of diffusing the boundaries around social work. I take great courage, for instance, of the affinity which is spreading in more countries now between social work and what is called social pedagogy. Social pedagogy has always emphasized much more the communal aspect of solving problems, of facing up to life's challenges. And I think if we lower the barriers between care work, social work, pedagogical work, education, and so on, we can discover great forms of alliance that also help social workers to break out of the enormous isolation and specialization into which they have been packaged. I note with great alarm how social workers are pressurized to deliver particular outcomes in agencies that themselves then are again being paid when they're outsourced for the results that they are achieving. And I think this calls for a complete stop to those kind of tendencies, and a reaffirmation of our autonomy and of our knowledge bases that can argue that even in economic terms, it doesn't make sense to have these short-term and narrowly oriented targets when phenomena like what I wanted to expand on a little bit, like mental health, are quite clearly linked to communal processes, to political structures, to the economic conditions in which people live. And unless mental health as a growing concern is being addressed in the context of these kind of interdisciplinary and also the resource sharing considerations in community, I think again the costs will escalate in one area and will rebound in the neglect of the coordinated approaches. So yes, you're well positioned to mention the Scottish community education tradition in this context again. And I think, yeah, Britain has to learn from Scotland once more in that regard as well.
Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, I guess for me, I think Scottish social work maybe has to, yeah, maybe one alliance would be to sort of more clearly work with people within community education and development, because I think they face the same pressures, but it is, I think it's a challenge having to feel like you're biting the hand that feeds you if you're working within state structures. But I guess this notion of forging alliances and starting with what you can do makes complete sense. So I've noticed I'm just moving on. I know the minutes are precious, and I'm looking to see, we've got some comments here that I shall just read. So from Colin Turbett, Walter, that resonates with me so much, the idea that care workers are recognised as essential heroes and social workers are not. And that you're going to tell us more about that later, so we'll look forward to that, Colin. And from Shahana, thanks for that thought-provoking presentation. And a question here, I wonder to what extent are your reflections merely concerned with what you've observed in the global north rather than the global south? So again, I've asked the Scottish question, and I guess Shahana is coming from a global south perspective, and I wondered what thoughts you have on.
Yes, I do acknowledge that my immediate knowledge and contacts refer to the European perspective, even though I think some of the observations that I can make in Central and Eastern Europe have great affinity also with other regions of the globe. I think, however, I'm doing a great literature review on social work and the corona crisis from the publications that have been emerging there. And my impression is that in the global south, even the existing cultural and also by necessity arisen collective responses are being put under severe test in the corona crisis, that for reasons of communication alone, the selection of what types of service users, social workers, can maintain contact with is already becoming an instrument of selection and separation. And social workers are resisting that very courageously, very often at their own risk. And communities are organizing themselves in overcoming the barriers and limitations imposed. But I think the pressures, whether they are economic pressures, whether they are organizational pressures on social services, I would expect from what I'm reading there to be universal pressures, at least in that direction, even though the effects might be mitigated by particular national and local traditions.
Walter, thank you so much. I'm sure we will return to some of these questions before. I'm conscious that we are over time as ever. If there's maybe time for one more, if there's one comment, if you want to put your hand up now. If not, we shall move on.